I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Josh. I'm just a student at the university. So yeah, I'm not used to chairing an event like this, but I'll give it my best go. So the title of the talk today is Fundamentalism and Human Rights, which I think is a very timely topic, and I think these are two issues which go together quite well. I guess I don't know what sort of direction the talk will go in, but initially, fundamentalism and human rights, the relationship between the two, perhaps most apparently seems to be how fundamentalism as a concept, even though it's a very sort of heated concept, I'm sure the speakers today will talk a bit more about how it's used and the definition. But I guess fundamentalism to mean sort of strict adherence to certain beliefs, normally with a religious connotation, I suppose links with human rights in the sense that fundamentalist groups or fundamentalists have opens questions about how much they adhere to human rights, which I guess is a timely issue with so-called fundamentalist groups on the rise in parts of the world, and groups like ISIS obviously posing deep issues for human rights of the people in the region. And I guess the link between the two also could be linked to how the kind of so-called battle against fundamentalism, and particularly in the sort of war on terror era, has invaded our human rights, and whether finding the balance between dealing with fundamentalism but in a way which doesn't restrict our human rights. And this is also very, I think, a timely question, particularly with, I guess, yesterday is very much in the news of America with a report about the CIA's torture of terror suspects, and this question about how countries deal with fundamentalism whilst not breaching fundamental human rights, which they most certainly have. Without further ado, I'll pass you on to the speakers. So today we've got Professor Sajjad Rizvi from Exeter University, and we've got Abdullah Andalusi and Mr. Subhi from Exeter Mosque, and Paul Davies also from, he's the Devon Police Commander. So that's great. So we've got a range of speakers who will talk a little bit more about this topic, and then we'll open up some questions from you, hopefully, in the end. So yeah, I don't know who would like to kick us off. Yeah, Sajjad, let's start.
Okay. Well, good evening, and thanks for coming. I think the idea was to make this as interactive as possible, so I will literally speak for just a few minutes, and then pass on to my colleagues who will add certain things. I think the main reason, perhaps, why the topic has been posed in a particular way is that there's a basic assumption that fundamentalisms, which are normally considered to be certain types of social, sometimes political commitments to religious faith, act as constraints to liberties, and potentially act as constraints to rights within communities, either those communities associated with those religious beliefs or perhaps even those beyond that. So in a sense, it's the idea that fundamentalisms pose a challenge to conceptions of human rights. But at the same time, I think we need to understand where conceptions of human rights come from. This event today, as I note, is part of a commemoration of the International Human Rights Day, which is a UN-sanctioned celebration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, which came in pretty much at the end of the Second World War, and is a culmination of thinking over rights and liberties, which have been ongoing, certainly in Western, or certainly in European thought for a number of centuries, but particularly came out of the experience of the Second World War, an experience of brutality of people being killed, of course, in conflict, but also a number of civilians being killed, genocide occurring, and so forth. So there was a need that if we're going to move forward in an era in which we eliminate the possibility of war and mass killing, we also need to eliminate the sorts of abuses and oppression that individual human beings around the world might suffer. So part of that process would require us to come up with a basic list of rights that everyone should have, which are inalienable and which are natural and innate to everyone insofar as they are human beings. And these are rights which are not, in a sense, negotiable. They are not conditioned by gender, by sexuality, by race, by creed, and by any other type of tribal or other sort of distinction we might want to make between humans. And of course, the idea was that the international community, through the UN, signed up to these basic rights. And in many cases, that involved a certain sort of level of shifting and thinking through what those rights meant for particular types of cultural contexts. As I said, the Universal Declaration very much comes out of European thinking, at least from the 17th century, but it was not something which was a natural outcome of the intellectual history that other parts of the world had undergone. So in certain cases, the question was, well, is the concept of a human right a universal concept? Is it something that everyone shares? And if they don't necessarily use the term, what else do they use? Are there certain fundamental things that we all agree are true of humans? So if I give you one very simple idea which was invoked by a number of Muslim jurists when they were discussing this in the immediate context of the Universal Declaration, it was things like, well, what is basic that each one of us has? And one of the notions was we all have this notion of human dignity. Human dignity is absolutely basic to everyone. It's a suitably vague concept, but what it does then potentially lead to is how that dignity might be violated with respect to certain types of constraints which are put on it. And attached to this was a way of looking at whether we can think of liberty in a more positive sense, because most concepts of liberty coming out of European thought, certainly from the 17th century, seem to have been conditioned in a negative sense. It was, the freedom not to be imposed upon in certain ways. And this is then enshrined in law. So, for example, in English common law, you have notions around the fundamental violation of your right as a human is associated with the concept of harm, for example, as a basic thing. And then harm can then be extrapolated into all sorts of things, harming your interests, harming the person, it potentially can involve criminal infringement on the person and so forth. The notion was primarily a negative one. So then the question is, should issues around rights focus just on negative issues? Should it just be about violations? Or should it also think in terms of those sorts of values or goods that we would like to privilege, which actually help our flourishing as human beings? And that's where, for example, things like right to education might arise. You could, of course, say things like right to clean water and just certain basic health conditions could actually be negative, an extension of negative liberty. But certainly the notion that you might have the right not to be infringed upon in certain ways, but you might also have a right to certain types of goods which lead to the flourishing of your person as well. And as I said, broadly speaking, the notion is that fundamentalisms could potentially constitute constraints or violations of those rights, whether those rights are negative or whether those rights are positive, either through moral coercion of some sort. It could be legal coercion of some sort enshrined in laws in certain states. And it could even take on a theological face, in the sense that people might try to argue that there is a theological reason why your rights or your liberties might be infringed upon in certain ways. So that's kind of just really setting it up. But I would focus on this notion that we need to think of rights as more than just things which shouldn't happen to us, or we have a right not to basically be violated in certain ways. I think it's very important to think in terms of the flourishing of human flourishing as being a very important part of that. And also to think of human rights as, potentially something which engages pretty much all aspects of our lives. So it's not just an issue for, say, people out there, who might be brutalized in a particular conflict situation in some ways. It's also much more immediate, and that's, of course, I think a lot of the thinking around the Human Rights Act, which again I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which came in the late 90s, and it's unfortunate that nowadays some politicians are talking about repealing it, which is certainly to my mind deeply disturbing, and it reveals a certain mindset as well, which is problematic. But certainly that legislation really gives you an idea of what might constitute quite an expansive notion of human rights, which goes beyond narrow issues of violation of the person and harm. And I'll just say one thing about, I won't discuss the torture report, we can discuss that later. I won't discuss things like ISIS, again, we can discuss that later. But one thing I will say is that one of the responses, certainly in Muslim contexts, and I know this has happened in certain Jewish contexts as well, to human rights discourse is to say, well, okay, so human rights discourse comes out of a particular philosophical background, which is broadly speaking Protestant and broadly speaking increasingly secular. So how can we discuss certain inalienable things we can, or goods that humans have the right to, from our own particular perspectives as Muslims, Jews, or whatever? And in the Muslim context, one thing which has become, I think, dominant is this idea that that the divine law privileges certain basic goods. And if we keep that in mind, then these are certain basic goods that all humans have an inalienable right to. And these are things like life, these are things like family, these are things like to be taken serious as rational agents, to have a right to education, to have a right to own property, interestingly, which again, some people might disagree. And there's certain basic rights, and then on the basis of that notion of basic goods, You've had juristic thinking, which is trying to expand that list of goods into a whole set of other goods. So that's one potential way in which one might think about rights in a different context. But I'll just throw that as the last thing. But the main thing is really to see about how do we have an expansive notion of rights, and to what extent does whatever we want to consider fundamentalism to be, how does it challenge it? And when it's a simple, straightforward case of a gross violation, it's very easy to deal with. But how do we deal with more conceptual kind of problems which might arise? And I've already gone way over what I said I would do. I'll hand it back. I'm an academic. We can talk. That's what we're paid for. I'll hand you back to Josh.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Sajjad. That's very interesting. Don't know who would like to.
Shall I just give a brief opening, if I may? Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Davies. I'm a Chief Superintendent with Devon Cornwall Police. I'm the policing commander for Devon. That's the day job. I will open up with my view of the world from a policing perspective, if I may. As you can see, I am a police officer, so it's not surprising that I would focus on that area of the business, if you like. I think it's fair to say that fundamentalism and human rights is a extremely complex and on occasion challenging area for us to police effectively and on occasion appropriately. And the reason I say that is from a societorial point of view. I think all too often fundamentalism is viewed as societorially, in wider society, fundamentalism is viewed as and misconstrued as extremism, and all too often extremism equals violent extremism in the minds of wider society. And therefore, on occasion, and I make no defence of this, but I think the CIA report that has already been referred to, occasionally you see the misconception that you should police and manage violent extremism in an extreme way. And for me, that flies in the face of human rights and the fundamental human rights that every basic human being should be entitled to. Policing should allow, should accommodate, and should cater for extreme views. Extreme views do not equal violent extremism, and all too often I think that is sometimes lost in the broader media coverage and so on and so forth, and the debate that this subject engenders. We do have a job within law enforcement, not only nationally but internationally, to ensure that the line between fundamentalism, extremism, violent extremism, is not muddied and is policed effectively, but is not policed in a way that denigrates the fundamental rights of individuals. And for me, it is really important for us to ensure that the human rights of both individuals and groups are not denigrated and evaded, and the excuses put forward that that is done because we are policing violent extremism per se, if that makes sense. My colleague next to me has suggested that the abuse, the oppression of fundamental human rights is unacceptable. I would agree. And all too often the policing of fundamentalism and human rights in its broadest sense tips over, in my view, tips over, and the CIA report within the US is an example of this. The balance is tipped, and it's tipped in a way that I think is unacceptable. Human dignity is a basic right of everybody, I agree with that, but I don't underestimate that this is a complex area for us within law enforcement and policing, and it's an area that on occasion we struggle with. I'll leave it at that for now, but I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. And now who would like to speak next? Okay.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I just read some Arabic. I'll translate it for you. It means all praises are due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the Arabic name of God. If you can't hear me, if you look at the Christian Arabs, they also, if you look at the Bible, the Arabic Bible, they also use the name Allah. So Allah is the Arabic name of God. And we praise Him in any sort of gathering to make the gathering a bit more blessed, and His mercy is showered upon on the gathering. Talking of His mercy, the word mercy in Arabic is rahmah, and because God is Ar-Rahman, which means the most merciful. And just as an example, the word rahim in Arabic, which actually means the womb. The womb is an organ of the human body which is indiscriminate, and it is compassionate to whatever it contains. In the same way, God's mercy and God's graciousness is universal to all of His creation. Secondly, through His mercy and through His graciousness, He sent prophets throughout time, from Adam, Abraham, Noah, David, Solomon, Jesus, Moses, and lastly the final messenger, Muhammad, peace be upon him. The reason why I start with this is because ironically, when you hear the title Fundamentalism and Human Rights, within the opening speech or opening speeches, you generally, if that discussion happens, whether it's in this setting or in a more casual setting, Islam comes in a negative connotation, a negative light, meaning that Islam is, or Muslims are abusing human rights, for example, and which is quite ironic. And I want to hopefully dispel that kind of idea today. Hopefully we can do that. And one of the things we have, as I mentioned earlier, that from His graciousness, God revealed revelation, or He sent revelation to these messengers. And the last of these messengers is Muhammad, and the revelation that was given to him is what we call the Quran. And another name of the Quran is also called the Furqan. And so we can use the Furqan, which means the criterion, to differentiate between what is right and what is wrong, what is bad and what is good. And this is one of the roles and one of the purposes of the Quran. And from the Quran, the scholars who have studied it have determined a code of conduct for life, how we can spend our day-to-day activities in the best way, in the way that would impress God, and so that we can further earn His mercy and His grace. And the Quran allows us, and the revelation allows us, along with the practical implementation of the Quran, which is what we know from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. We understand, or we have a more balanced relationship with God, a balanced relationship with each other, and a balanced relationship with ourselves. And so what the Quran does, and it describes itself as wasat. This religion describes itself as wasat, which means balanced, the middle way. And so Islam clarifies this. If we look into the teachings of Islam, it clarifies what is extreme and what isn't extreme. And so hopefully, if we can shed light on some of the ways how Islam does this. So from the Quran and from the teachings of the Prophet, the Sharia is formed, and it has a lot of negative connotations, and I see a few smirks, but the Sharia actually, and the life of the Prophet actually was one of the first times in history when human rights was actually established. And just to touch on it, there's several things which the Sharia preserves. And firstly, as both the speakers spoke earlier, is the preservation of one's dignity, one's respect. And we also see this in our law here in Britain, in terms of the defamation law and things like this. Another thing that the Sharia preserves is life. And thirdly, as Sajjad touched upon, is in terms of property. And lastly, actually, the fourth thing that it preserves is one's family unit. And lastly, of course, freedom of religion and freedom of belief. And it's not only just it's the gaining of each of these, so meaning gaining of property, establishing your family, but also securing it and maintaining it. And anything that causes those things to be vulnerable or weakened, or causes it to be insecure, that is where Islam would declare that there's injustice here. I hope that makes sense. So Islam is a way that someone where justice is brought, or something that is unjust is clarified. And so the person or people who are perpetrating any injustice, they are held responsible. And so this is just the basic idea of Sharia, and it's not just the end result, which people think that might be some to do with some sort of punishments, or maybe some actions of some people in today that we see in the world, in what we see in the news and stuff like that. We'll touch upon that anyway, and so that's just basically a summary of what I want to say today, and I hope that was clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that. This is Subhi, and lastly we've got Abdullah Andalusi from the Exeter Mosque also.
Oh, no, a Muslim Debate Initiative.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. The Muslim Debate Initiative.
Okay.
We're Muslims who initiate debate. I suppose that's keys in the name. But basically, what my organisation does is we like to show that people can have robust debates on even the most trickiest or controversial topics, but it's still being amicable and friendly despite being intellectually robust. And that's pretty much what we kind of do. But following from that ethos. First and foremost, I wanted to state very, very clearly on this topic, fundamentalism and human rights. The Muslim community, if we were following the fundamentals of our belief to its fullest extent in the context of living in the UK, we would naturally be model citizens in the UK. Islam commands us to be good to our neighbours. It doesn't say your neighbour has to be Muslim or non-Muslim. It doesn't differentiate. It just says good to your neighbours, feed the poor, give charity, teach knowledge, and just be of benefit to your fellow man. And the Prophet Muhammad, his example when he was a minority in the city of Mecca during the pagan era of Mecca, he helped old ladies with their groceries. He helped. He fed the poor. He was concerned over how slaves were treated by the pagan powers that be at that point in time, and he was concerned over Jews and over Christians. There was no differentiation saying only Muslims. No, he was actually for all mankind. And this is why we say in Islam that Prophet Muhammad was a mercy for all mankind, because he gave us an example of how to treat all mankind by these principles. So a Muslim following the fundamentals of their belief would be a model citizen, not because we aspire to some kind of civic nationalism, but just as a result of following our ideals, we would be good citizens. And also, I'd like to mention that despite a lot of what the contentions are with certain sections of the media, politicians, and a minority of people in security forces, most people in the UK, most police officers on the beat, most Muslims are all generally very nice people who don't really want to cause trouble to anyone else, who want to get on with their lives and don't want to live in any kind of conflict or tension or so on. So most people are generally well-intentioned, and they don't generally wake up in the morning thinking we want to cause trouble for other people, or we want to do bad things for other people. So really the problem is that we have to deal with these problematic minorities in every segment and community and group, which I suppose are aching for a fight, aching for these kind of tensions there. But I think just to address the actual, the title, I suppose, it's very interesting. What is fundamentalism? How would you define fundamentalism. If it's the belief in fundamental principles, then surely we all should believe in certain fundamental principles of which we should, hold up as a standard and measure our lives and compare it to be otherwise is being a hypocrite or hypocritical. Someone who's so pragmatic they have no principles, we would say is someone who acts hypocritically or acts very selfishly. So we should all be people of principle. And the belief in human rights, the Western conception of it, is itself a fundamentalism. If you hold that to be a set of fundamental values which you hold to be inviolable, that is fundamentalism. So everyone that says they believe in human rights is a fundamentalist by definition. Otherwise, if you don't believe in a form of rights and so on, then what do you believe in is the question. But the thing is, the problem is not all fundamentalisms are considered equal or respected, depending on which fundamental beliefs are held by the one who judges this. One man's extremist is another man's centre or middle of the road person. Another man's centre or middle of the road individual is another man's extremist. So who decides? It can be depending on your perspective. But I think what should be respected and acknowledged in any of these situations is what is mainstream, what is orthodox, and what is normative in any particular belief system or idea or ideal. And then that's where real engagement and real debate can happen. It's not helpful to begin an engagement or a debate by calling someone an extremist who therefore doesn't deserve the right to fully express themselves or have access to equal platforms that others enjoy to express themselves, such as what happens with the UK government's increasing measures to restrict quote-unquote extremists from university. That opens up a Pandora's box, because do you really want politicians defining for you what is extremism, what ideas are acceptable and what ideas are not acceptable? I don't think anyone here wants or trusts politicians to do that. Their job is supposedly meant to be guaranteeing our security, not policing thought or dictating what thought should and shouldn't be acceptable. But of course people might say, but what about the problem of terrorism? Well, any cause has been used to justify terrorism, or has been the basis for terrorism. Is a methodology, it's not an ideology. The suffragettes used terrorism, they used pipe bombs, they used arson, they even used physical violence for their cause. We would define that as terrorism. Back then they were called anarchists. That was the old version of terrorism, but now we call it terrorism. Obviously anarchist terrorists were well known 100 years ago and throughout last century. Even those who believe in liberalism, or you might call freedom, have committed acts of terrorism. The Nicaraguan Contras were an anti-communist, pro-freedom group, and they committed many horrific acts of terrorism. Even, shockingly but true, Nelson Mandela's group committed acts of terrorism. They blew up shopping malls, restaurants, cafes, killing men, women and children. So it would fit the definition of terrorism, even though his cause was against a racist state, which obviously we all support, a cause against apartheid, against racism. While we all support that cause, we wouldn't, of course, support the methodology which was used by Mandela's group, but that's actually was historically true. Communists have used terrorism, of course, fascists have used terrorism, and of course, people who identify themselves as Muslim have also used terrorism. Terrorism is a methodology, it's not an ideology. It doesn't spring from any particular belief system idea, it's just a methodology enacted by some people who view it as beneficial for them to use that methodology, even if it goes against their ideological principles. Now this brings me to the issue of human rights, and I think it's very pertinent considering I was mentioning the CIA torture report that was recently released. I think the problem arises with perhaps the Western understanding of rights, which I would say in some cases in a pretense to universality is called human rights. But all worldviews, ideologies and religions, everyone believes in rights for humans. We just differ as to, where you set the balance, or what are these rights, or how they look like, or, what are the particular measures of these rights. So the issue is, no one disagrees that humans should get some rights. The issue is, what are these rights, and where do you draw these limitations? And I think if you explore the Western conception justification for human rights, it's there where we find maybe there's some troubling philosophical problems. The first concept was natural rights, the idea that, and this was the first conception of human rights in the Western Enlightenment era, which was that we all had natural rights given to us by nature for life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, which was later changed to happiness. Then it became synonymous. The issue with this, of course, is that where does nature give you rights? If you're on a desert island with natural predators, lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, would they actually respect your natural rights to life? Does evolution respect the rights of creatures to live? Not necessarily. Doesn't at all. I could also argue, if you say that rights are deserved because people are human, and so one of these rights is, let's say, the right to freedom, then what about criminals who are in jail? Have they ceased being human? And if their right to liberty was just based or predicated on of them being human, then you shouldn't put them in jail because they're still human. Whereas what we would all say, intuitively is, well, no, they don't deserve it because of what they did. So then there's something now beyond just rights because you're human. There's now rights based on maybe what you deserve. And now that opens up an interesting discussion. But natural rights was done away with. Jeremy Bentham famously said, natural rights is nonsense on stilts. And he tried to bring in this new idea of utilitarianism, which is basically we give rights or certain rights because it's conducive to the most good or the greatest good possible. And then John Stuart Mill ran with that idea. But the problem with this, of course, is ultimately what that really means is that you only get rights as long as it's convenient. And that's what happens. When there's a security situation occurring, then there's justification. We need to take away certain rights or freedoms for the sake of protecting security of the people. People's lives are more important than just their freedom. You don't have any freedom if you're dead, so that's their argument. And then they take away rights. And of course, the CIA torture report, and of course some people in the CIA cite how torturing people saved lives and how there was a justification for torture. The UK government and David Cameron's muscular liberalism is used to say we have to eliminate terrorism by restricting rights on freedom of expression. Theresa May said the laws aren't sufficient to catch everyone. It doesn't catch all the extremists who remain within the law. The glaringly obvious problem of that is you shouldn't be trying to catch people who stay within the law. You shouldn't be doing that. If they're within the law, that's exactly where you want them. You can't say, you're within the law, we have to catch you. We have to catch you as well. They haven't skipped the net. You shouldn't be catching them in the first place. But this is the problem and now we see these new, they want to unveil this new, what you call extremist ASBOs, and Theresa May's new counter-terrorism law, which basically will force universities to restrict certain speakers deemed extremist by the powers that be, by the government. It has caused many problems, and of course, many in the police have also said they don't want to be the full police. But unfortunately, with the police services, they are the executors of the law, and they don't have a choice as in what the law is. But I think together, us and the average policeman as the average public, we should push back against the government and make a solid message saying that you can't take away, you should not take away these freedoms based on an inflation of security threats. The world is a dangerous place. It always has been. Never stopped being a dangerous place. But the question is, how do you want to live? And who will determine how you live? And we don't trust politicians, and we shouldn't trust politicians enough to give them the reins of power to determine what ideas are good or what ideas are not good. Now I'll end my presentation by saying this. There is a huge degree of misconception about the Sharia. I'm not a revisionist or a modernist Muslim that adopts some kind of modern idea or methodologies about interpreting the Sharia. I believe in the Sharia, as was revealed, unchanged. But if you look at history at the time of when you had these Islamic Sharia regimes or states in Al-Andalus, Spain and Portugal, Cordoba, in the Ottomans, throughout the Middle East, for hundreds of years, you didn't see a Taliban-like regime. You didn't see an ISIS-like regime. You saw Christians, Muslims, and Jews living side by side. There was open public debate. There was books being published by Christians which were criticizing Islam in Islamic Antioch, in Baghdad. Atheists were criticizing Islam in public debate because that was for intellectual reasons. That was an intellectual debate, and Islam is all for that. But you wouldn't imagine that if you're looking at the post-colonial constructs, which are these so-called Muslim regimes in the Middle East. And I would urge people that I think the problem with the Muslim world is not fundamentalism, but they're not fundamentalist, and they need to be more fundamentalist. Go back to the fundamentals of Islam, which actually gave societies where they had tolerance. No, I wouldn't say tolerance. I'd say acceptance of minorities. Christians had their own law system, their own areas where they could live whatever they want. We didn't say you must believe in our values, one law for all, our values. No, we actually gave multiple law systems depending on your belief. If you're a Jew, you have a Jewish law system. If you're a Christian, you have a Christian law system. You have your own courts. We didn't have issues with arbitration like you see when people mention Sharia arbitration courts. Look how hysteria is generated. I think maybe the modern Western countries could learn something from the history of even the Ottoman state of how to deal with minorities, but giving them their space to fully express themselves, including their law systems and their ideas, and really not interfering with people's ideas of how they want to live their life. So I think maybe that's some interesting thoughts to go by. And I think, as I said, what the Muslim world needs is more fundamentalism and not less, because the modern world is somewhat very different from what the world used to be in the past, where you didn't see the kind of problems you saw now. Yazidis, Christians and Jews who had to flee many of these lands you see in the Middle East right now. Why did they have to flee? What were they doing there in the first place? They were there for 1,400 and even beyond that, unmolested, untouched, oldest churches, oldest synagogues there. Yazidis were there for hundreds of years. No one touched them under Islamic rule for 1,400 years. So if there's a problem now, it's a modern problem and has nothing to do with Islam or fundamentalism, and has everything to do with certain political policies by certain political bigwigs who really only care about your vote but don't care about your opinion, and implement their own policy as they see fit, despite the fact that we may disagree with it, and it affects us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Abdullah, and thanks a lot to all the four speakers. If we raise a quick hand, please. They all touched upon a variety of issues, but all very important, and hopefully ones which have inspired some thoughts and questions. So if we'd like to open up to the floor, has anyone got any questions to ask to the panel as a whole, or a certain speaker in particular?
I'm coming at this from a bit of a tangent. Until I was in my 20s, I had no rights at all as an openly gay man in this country. I was regarded as the enemy, the outsider. I was twice asked to leave the church and never come back. There were certain families who said I could never visit them because they have children in the house. I'm an outsider. I still see myself very largely as an outsider. My situation with human rights has improved. Law has changed considerably. Faith communities have changed considerably. We've at least got to separation, some cases acceptance, still some way to go in being able to celebrate our faith together. Things have changed an awful lot since I was young. But I still come across usually people who are using a book, a textbook, to attack me, whether it be Torah, whether it be the Old Testament, whatever. So I'm interested in where the authority of a fundamentalist comes from. Does it come from a textbook, a religious book? Does it come from historical practice? Does it come from shared ideas which are not actually put clearly into words? Where does authority lie?
Okay. Well, it depends which religion you're talking about, which idea, belief system, or concept. Everyone has a basis for why they justify any of the ideas they hold, and it depends who you're talking about. Communists will have a different idea. a libertarian, liberal, Muslim, Christian, Jew, Zoroastrian. Everyone has maybe different ideas. Sometimes it is a revealed book. So in the bookish religions of obviously Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, they have a book. They also have traditions alongside it. So Jews have the Mishnah and Talmud. Christians, depending on which sect you speak to, and so on, and the list goes on. But I would like to make a very pertinent point. Up until the mid 19th century, there was no word to discriminate or classify humans by their sexual preference. Prior to that, it was what was banned in Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, and Islam is a certain practice. But they paid no attention to the motivations of the individual, whether their preference was one way or other, or somewhere in between. Actually, the real reality of even sexuality, as Kinsey reported, is a more of a scale. It's not it's not necessarily as black and white as you think. So people who are majority heterosexual might be homosexual in some aspects or some preferences, and vice versa. I'd say that what you call homosexuals became discriminated as soon as you invented a label to say you're homosexual. That's when it began, the discrimination. In Islamic civilization, while there's certain practices, all premarital sex or extramarital sex is prohibited in Islam, whoever it's done to, by, and whatever their preference. It was really, the focus was on the action. We don't, Islam and, I won't speak for other religions, I'll just speak for Islam here as a Muslim. We don't judge people by the preferences or the tastes or the motivations they have inside them. But because ultimately all human beings, we believe, have, you can't control your desires. God tells us through our sources that He doesn't judge people by what desires they have, and so we don't judge it either, and we have no word to classify people by that. Unfortunately, what you're seeing, I can't speak for, I know in the European history was very specific as to what happened with considering homosexuality a mental disease, and it criminalized it and so on. But speaking, we can't look at the whole world from a Eurocentric lens. In the Muslim world, it was for 1,400 years we had no laws against gays or against the homosexual or whatever. We didn't have a description or delineation of that. The political Sharia, in its political implementation, has no jurisdiction in the privacy of your own home. Which is one of the things that most people don't realize is what you do in your own house is between you and God, basically. If you go out, it's basically only if you go outside and you literally engage in lewd acts in public. When I mean by lewd acts, I mean intercourse, not holding hands or kissing. In Arabic culture, men can hold hands and kiss, and that's just fine. But lewd acts in public are prohibited, which I think you'll find is the same in Britain as well. You can't commit lewd acts in public, and obviously you'll be arrested if you do. And that's all the Sharia, the political Sharia, is concerned with. As for the nature of, some people might say that treating a certain act as a sin might also ostracize people and so on. Well, here's the thing. Certain actions, premarital or extramarital relations, are only a sin for those who believe they're a sin. What I mean by that is, if you're not a Muslim, then we don't expect you to follow our standards. The Sharia, another misconception is that the Sharia is applied universally. It's not. It's only for Muslims. So basically, a Muslim who says, I'm a Muslim, has consented to the application of the Sharia in an Islamic state throughout history. Christians, Jews, atheists, and so on, they were left to their own ideas, devices, their own criteria. There was even a discussion with an Islamic scholar from the classical period called Imam Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi, who said, when regarding to Zoroastrians who are a minority amongst, they were living amongst Muslims, and Zoroastrians, some particular sect had a practice called self-marriage, which was in essence incest, or marital incest, and so on. And there was a discussion as to what Muslims should do regarding this. And the general rule was that, well, as abhorrent as we think ancestral marriage is, it's not for us to impose upon them our value system. That was the general rule. There was some debate about maybe kids, how it would affect the children and so on. But generally speaking, the general rule was no matter how abhorrent we might think ancestral marriage is, and it's something that is not allowed in England, of course. But even that, we said, well, if it's what they do, it's what they believe. We have no right to get involved in what they believe, and that's how the Sharia treated people who had ideas which the Sharia would disagree with. So I think we didn't get the kind of what you call homophobia, which pervaded in Europe. We didn't have homophobia because we didn't classify people in the first place. So the first discrimination was discrimination by the label. But what I will say this: there are Muslims in the UK who do incite hatred to people who using the label gay or homosexual, and you'll see them on TV, on front pages of newspapers, because they always catch the front pages apparently. But the thing is this: they're actually adopting a Victorian era concept which doesn't have any basis within Islam. And so, as I said, I'm a fundamentalist. I want to go back to the fundamentals. I don't adopt Victorian era concepts which cause only trouble. So I only see humans. I don't see heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, just like I don't see Marmite lovers and non-Marmite lovers. It's such an arbitrary delineation. So that would be the answer, I think, from the Sharia perspective.
You asked the question, where does the authority come from? And you alluded to, I'm assuming, back in the 60s when homosexuality was actually illegal. And that, in this day and age, almost seems incredulous to think that was the case. And it goes back to a Victorian era where that thinking was allowed in law. And we have moved on since then. But as an openly gay man, I am sure that you are subjected to bigotry, ignorance, hatred on occasion, and I find that unacceptable. And I think, I genuinely believe that all too often society allows that, and the culture that we live within allows that bigotry and intolerance, and all too often we acquiesce to that because that's the easiest option. And I do think, and I don't want to sit here and blame the media for everything, but I do think if you just pick up your daily papers, if you look at society at large, that intolerance is evident on an almost daily basis. And I think how that practically plays out is the sort of bigotry, ignorance, and on occasion hatred that you would be subjected to within this area as an openly gay man. And as society, we allow that to happen. How can we defend that? I don't think we can.
I've made a career of standing up against it.
Yes, yeah, and
a lot of people
I
know have had to tell another.
Yes, of course, and you're no longer a lone voice, and you're no longer feeling that you have to hide your sexuality because of the intolerances of society. But they are still there, and we kid ourselves if we think they're not, and we kid ourselves if bigotry, ignorance, and that lack of just general awareness doesn't impact the way we treat not only people who are gay, but people who have different faiths, people who are somehow deemed to be different. And it's that difference that all too often society is intolerant, in my view.
Does anyone else have any points about this issue? Or
Actually, I'll make just a brief interjection just to also clarify something else. I have also noticed that there is also the contrary. There was a Christian preacher who said that he said homosexuality is a sin. I wouldn't use the label, but he did anyway, and he was arrested and fined for what he said. Homosexuality is a sin. Okay, it's not for me to tell Christians what to say. Obviously, I'm not a Christian. But I think that also we have to be on the guard for the opposite ostracization of people who have certain beliefs. As long as they don't discriminate anyone, or they don't mistreat, insult or abuse anyone, if they want to believe a particular activity or action is a sin, then they should have the freedom to preach that. And I'm talking about that Christian guy. But obviously, the line is drawn if they say we should, if they say you must, mistreat people who do X, Y, and Z, or are X, Y, and Z, or you must X. Obviously, that's a line we all agree to draw. But to preach one's moral beliefs, I think should be allowed. I don't think that Christian guy should have been arrested. I disagree with maybe his use of labeling there, not the wisest. But we have to also be careful we don't go the opposite extreme, and in our drive to stamp out discrimination and mistreatment of people, that we don't discriminate and mistreat other people at the same time. So you have to play a very careful balancing act as well to preserve people's right to just express their beliefs. As long as they're not forcing you to adopt that belief, then they should be allowed to express it. And so that's just my 2 cents on that.
Yes, I think it's this fine line about incitement to hatred. And again, as you say, if it's inciting people to behave cruelly against somebody else and add to their ignorance, and that's the problem that we have.
I think the crux of some of this debate has just been alluded to, really. It's we have to draw that line. Now, where that line is drawn will be in different places, depending on individuals, depending on groups, etc. But that could be an age-old debate, couldn't it? We could debate that all night, frankly. The rights and wrongs as to where that line is drawn. I mean, I'm not suggesting we don't, but and we may have different views. I don't suggest that freedom of expression shouldn't be allowed. I take your view that a comment that homosexuality is a sin. I fundamentally disagree with it. I don't want to generalise because I don't know the specifics of that individual case, and being a police officer, I like to work with evidence and specifics. But in its broadest sense, there is a fine line between freedom of expression and unacceptable comments, behaviour, and across that line. Where that line should be drawn is the debate, really.
Yeah. I said my only point was that I don't want politicians deciding for us not acceptable or not acceptable views, or extremist views, not extremist views. So inciting hatred, we understand that concept. Inciting to violence, we understand that concept. It's pretty clear, more or less these concepts. And as I said, I also appreciate, especially after what I've been seeing in the United States, just how tactful the UK police are as well. And obviously we have a tradition in this country that the police exercise discretion and they carefully deliberate before they act. In the average Bobby, average policeman that does this, and that's something that's a good thing. But I suppose, just to kind of explain, with my organisation, Muslim Debate Initiative, why did we do debates? So the whole point was we wanted to show to people that, and we do really controversial topics, we wanted to show that you can do even the most controversial topics, topical debates, and say the most controversial things, but leave that hall or place amicably, with respect and with a great appreciation, without falling foul of inciting hatred or inciting violence. And I think that's something that is something we should really push back against recent government initiatives to outlaw extremism or to define extremism. But just for the record, preaching, and I think it would be more technically correct, would be, let's say, sodomy. So preaching sodomy is a sin. It isn't such an inciting to hatred thing, as much as I would say, for example, I believe that drinking alcohol is a sin and eating pork is a sin. Does it mean now I'm inciting hatred against everyone that drinks alcohol and everyone that eats pork? No, it's just a personal belief, a personal expression of a particular idea. I don't, doesn't necessarily follow that you are inciting hatred. And I think people should really, learn that distinction, because we don't want a situation where people are scared to express their opinions or ideas, or a chilling effect on people's right to express themselves. And that's really all my concern is.
So we've got slides.
I have a question to Professor Sajjad. The differentiation between the concepts of fundamentalism, radicalism or radicalization, and extremism. Sometimes people, they confuse those, especially earlier in the 90s, there were a group of women here set up themselves, call themselves women against fundamentalism, and associated with extremism, associated with radicalism. this is the confusion between the three concepts. If you can elaborate academically on those differentiations.
The problem is that it depends what you're talking about. So, broadly speaking, in Britain, I think there's been quite a sensible distinction between those. But for example, in France, that distinction doesn't exist. So, if one understands fundamentalism to be usually rather literalist, rather simple adherence to certain notions, both beliefs and practices, right, which are considered to be scriptural, then that doesn't necessarily have any implications for wider society. It certainly doesn't have necessarily any implications for security. And it could well be that that person that just ends up, either living within a very close community or perhaps not even leaving their home very much. They're not necessarily a threat, or they wouldn't constitute a violation on any other person as it is. With extremism, it's somewhat different. And then again, we have to distinguish between certainly what the working papers and the discussions going back from post 9/11, but certainly post 7/7, were making a very clear distinction between violent and what one might call non-violent extremism. So one, for example, might argue that someone vehemently preaching, say, against homosexuality is potentially an extremist, right? But if they're not actually advocating violence or even carrying it out, they're not a violent extremist. And once you get into the violent extremist category, then you are, I don't even want to get into the word radical because that's deeply problematic. I actually think radical is quite a positive concept. Go back to the 18th century, for example. Those who had a view on what happened in the French Revolution, they were the English radicals. And they actually were very much interested in defending people's liberties. So that's, I think, using radical in which literally means someone who wants to change the way things are, the status quo, as somehow meaning someone who's a terrorist, I think is deeply problematic. And it actually goes back to this issue of how increasingly, I think, it's not necessarily so much this difference that we're intolerant of, it's dissent we're intolerant of. I certainly think things have got worse since I was a kid, when there actually was a left wing in Britain. It doesn't really exist anymore. There was it seems, real debate in Parliament and not people playing Candy Crush. So I think things have really dramatically changed, and there should be the ability for someone to say, well, I have radical views, I think things should change. I think, for example, higher education should be free. Well, that's dangerous, I'm probably a terrorist. That's what radicalism is as far as I'm concerned. So the distinction between fundamentalism, or in an American political thought context, they're sometimes discussed as theocratic communities. So people like the Amish, usually people don't think the Amish are dangerous, right? But they're definitely fundamentalists, there's no doubt about that. And so, and then you have this thing about extremists might go a bit further and take things into the... So the question is, what are people doing in the public sphere, which is the issue. And the distinction between violent and non-violent category, there are lots of there's a lot of detailed research on this. And as I said, at the European level, it's really been a very clear... And I was a consultant on a number of these reports about 6-7 years ago, which were precisely setting it out. And there was a marked distinction between practice in Britain, Germany, Denmark, and, for example, France and Spain. In France and Spain, the distinction was just not accepted. So someone who basically dressed in a particular way, was very observant with prayer, read what I would consider quite boring literature on rules, would be considered to be potentially a terrorist, which makes absolutely no sense in most cases. and partly based on this idea of kind of some sort of conveyor belt to violence. And that was a given in places like France or Spain. In Britain, if you said that to someone in counter-terrorism, they would laugh, because quite simply they understood that that's not the profile of people they were dealing with. It really is about what are people professing in the public sphere. So there's that distinction. I mean, one thing separately which I'll just raise, which comes back to the question, is even if we accept difference, and I think we should accept difference, at what point should the state intervene? That's the real issue, right? And as I said, classically the notion is if there is the potential or the actuality of harm to a person, then the state should intervene regardless. And that's a fairly liberal principle which I would actually advocate is perfectly Islamic as well. I don't have a problem with that. How we define that, of course, sometimes can be very problematic. But certainly the notion that you shouldn't be allowed to harm someone, certainly shouldn't be allowed to harm someone in the name of culture or religion or whatever, it seems to me perfectly sensible. And that's, I think, the way in which the law does work in many contexts. But sometimes it's also about understanding having better contextual understanding. And the police, I'm sure, will admit that they've made lots of mistakes. We always come back to the same kind of classic counter-terrorism mistakes, which are the big mistakes which everyone sees. But sometimes what I found really interesting when we were doing some courses for the police, which hasn't happened recently, was how at times you got rather naive and interesting questions. So I remember years ago being asked by a community support officer, what does a Muslim house look like?
So can you speak up a bit?
What does a Muslim house look like? What should we look at? Like, would there be photos on the walls or not? And I thought that was quite an amusing question, because I wouldn't have thought of that. I wouldn't have thought that there are certain basic features of what a Muslim house looks like, just as I wouldn't have thought there'd be basic features necessarily of what a Cornish house looks like. So part of that was just kind of breaking that down. When you say that, and then okay, actually, yeah, it's more straightforward, and that sort of goes into cultural awareness, which I think is important. But cultural awareness, I think, should not actually stop people from taking action where harm is involved, because that's criminal. It's really simple. I mean, I think it's straightforwardly criminal, and that's where. And I think the state does have obligations, and citizens have obligations.
Just come to the question of the police, how define radicalization and radicalism.
I think you've just mentioned the potential of harm, and I think where the contention lies for me from a policing point of view very often is the potential of harm, the prevention of harm, the use of legislation in a way that potentially restricts basic human rights by putting in place action, preventative action, that curtails the human rights of individuals at a point that is premature to any harm being carried out. And that's the difficulty sometimes for us. So at what point do you intervene in a prevention role to ensure that the law is upheld? And again, it's where you draw the line. And that for us is a constant challenge, actually. And in very practical terms, it's a constant challenge. So if we have an EDL march here, I'm sure the majority of people within the room think that the philosophy of the EDL is in some ways flawed. Unacceptable. Whatever you might think as an individual, the policing of that is quite challenging for us, because going back to a colleague at the end here, what is absolute normal for some people is absolute extremism for others, and we're often the ones who have to make the distinction And we struggle with that sometimes, and that's where on occasion you see legislation being used inappropriately, because it's finding where to draw that line so that you don't end up in a situation that none of us want to be in. Does that answer your question?
I just had an interesting anecdote. I became Muslim, and before I was a Muslim, I was a bit of a military buff. I went to local bookshops, bought all kinds of books on the British Army and on warfare and so on. I just a bit military, armchair general basically. Now I became Muslim in the 90s. Again, not a problem. 90s, communism was defeated. Everyone was on a high, so hey, no problem. But as soon as 9/11 happened, I took all those books and threw them out, because as a Muslim, I thought, I do not want to be caught in my house with these books, lest I be thought of as somehow planning attack or having, according to one law, materials useful for the preparation and instigation of acts of terrorism, which is so vague, useful for the preparation of acts of terrorism. And I was so paranoid by that, I thought, I'm just going to throw all these books out. Even though these books you get from the local bookshop, they're not, secret manuals or what have you. And there was a case where a Muslim man, he was in a university, he was researching international relations and terrorism and so on, so that's part of his degree, and he downloaded a manual on terror groups or terrorist methodologies from a CIA website. So the CIA website was openly available for researchers, and he just downloaded it, and because he downloaded it, he was his house was raided, he was arrested, and he had to go through the courts. And he had to prove that basically he wasn't a terrorist and he wasn't having any terrorist intent. That is very worrying and concerning, because for Muslims now, we wonder, is your house going to be the next house that we kick down the door and you'll be raided at night time and suspected of terrorism and so on and so forth, for possessing books which anyone else who's not a Muslim could easily just get from the local store or download from an open source CIA website for researchers. Journalists do it, and he had to get his university lecturers and people involved to tell the police this is part of his course. The question is, what if he wasn't doing a course? What if he was just an avid researcher at home? Many of us like to research topics ourselves. What if he didn't have an alibi? Well, he'd be just another one of the statistic of Muslims who go to jail for terrorism. No one really questions why. We probably had it coming, or there was probably something there. And sometimes what I also find worrying is they use books which are not even advocating terrorism, but might be, you can see, have a radical viewpoint, like Sayyid Qutb books, for example. I don't think Sayyid Qutb advocates terrorism as far as I know. But because he has a different worldview, a different perspective, and they say, oh look, this person has an intent, or this person has a different worldview, that somehow makes them more prone to terrorism just because they have a different worldview. This is the real practical worries that the Muslim community are worried about right now. We are actually living in fear in England in the 21st century because of these tactics. And as I said, I threw all those books in, I just threw them out because I really didn't want to be another newspaper headline, and it said, Muslim guy caught with books on British Army. What would that sound like to you on the Sun newspaper, Daily Mail? It would sound like, oh, he's planning an attack on the British Army. Why would he have it for? Why would he have these books? Even though when I was non-Muslim before, I loved reading those kind of books. But I had to stop being a military buff as soon as I became Muslim, and after 9/11, because I felt criminalized, and I didn't have the same right as anybody else to partake in that. And so I think those are issues I think which need to be dealt with. And to comment on my colleague Sajjad's point about the laws which prevent, are obviously there to prevent physical harm from coming. And obviously we don't want laws which prevent future crimes, like you saw in the Minority Report, where they suspect that you probably were going to do this or you probably were going to do that at some point with no evidence. But there is another kind of form of oppression or repression, which is social ostracization, or being demonized in society, in the media, being banned from universities. A colleague of mine, Yusuf Estes, I was going to do a lecture with him up in Huddersfield University, I think it's Huddersfield, a joint lecture with him, and I discovered that the Home Office contacted the university and told him not that he shouldn't be giving a lecture, and they banned him from the university, even though he only talks about theological topics. I'm more controversial than him. He purely talks about just theological topics, but because they said, oh, he mentioned something about something to do with, I don't know, homosexuality or something somewhere in his life, that we have to now ban him. And he was also banned from Cardiff University. Universities are meant to be places of open discussion. And knowing Yusuf Estes, he's never incited hatred or told Muslims to hate people for their proclivities or their desires or anything like this. And so these are the kind of real issues which the Muslims face, and which many of us might not be aware of, because we're not obviously not being from the Muslim community, that we are worried with and we're concerned, and it creates anxiety amongst Muslims as well. We're stressed and we're worried every day. And so I think these are the issues which we need to address: the social ostracization of Islam, and also there should not be a distinction between violent extremism. There just shouldn't be a category called extremism, because once you have an allowable category called extremism, then that gives a green light to be socially ostracized in society. You could say something is illiberal, it's not liberal, that's fine, that's descriptive, but to say extremist, that's where the persecution begins, much like the Victorian labelling which happened and caused trouble thereafter.
So, have we got more? We've got a point there?
Yeah, I've been pleasing to hear from the police point of view the acceptance of difference. And Sajjad was saying about dissent. The British state, has got a bit of a history of being rather harsh with groups. And I think back when I was a bit younger, and how Irish people were treated because of the existence of IRA and IRA bonds. Plus, when there were sort of left-wing groups against nuclear weapons, for example, and they found themselves infiltrated and so on. I just wonder, we're talking here about, we've got lots of speakers from a sort of Muslim background, but there's lots of examples over the past, since the Second World War, which we equally could be talking about, not just sexuality.
Can I just comment on that theme? Basically, putting all this together and the practical manifestation of what's happening in terms of, for example, where do you draw the line on how to deal with groups like the EDL, for example. And EDL is an openly anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim movement, or tries to be. And but what I would say, what if this group was anti, for example, Jewish, or anti-Hindu, or anti-Sikh? The law does not protect the Muslims in the same way it protects other groups, because there is a kind of a flaw in the law, basically, in terms of we see that religious these other groups, and rightly so, they're protected by racial law. But when it comes to Muslims, the religious law does not really protect them, because in the law it states that only if they intend to do harm. Now, for example, someone gets attacked, and it's a blatant Islamophobic attack, and but when it comes to prosecuting them or arresting them, how are you to judge whether this person intended to do harm or whether this person was just randomly attacking you? So because of that, I mean, I hope you understand the point that I'm making, and how basically what's happening after 9/11, after 7/7, there's been such a massive rise on attacks against Muslims purely because of their faith, but it's not documented as so, and it's just and it's not counted as so. So yeah, it's just something that I want to ask you directly as a representative of the law enforcement, if you don't mind.
If I take that point, then I'll come back to the question you asked. Within Devon, so if we look at recorded crime, there's been a lot in the media around recorded crime and what certain police forces record and what others don't. I don't want to get into that debate. Actually, Devon Cornwall Police have been seen to be ethical in the way we record crime, and that's why quite often we will record things as a crime when other police forces won't. The recorded incidences of hate crime within Devon are so small that they cannot be an accurate reflection of the reality. And that's where, and I had a similar discussion at a transgender event only 2 weeks ago, that's where the trust and confidence in us as your local police is really, really important. Because if people are not coming to us to report this, and the figures are so small, I mean, I'd like to pat myself on the back and say, do you know what, hate crime doesn't happen in Devon because it's not recorded. Well, I'd be kidding myself because the figures are so small, in single figures, for some certain protected characteristics, in single figures. The recorded incidents are so small, they do not reflect the reality of it. I would wish that they would reflect the reality of it. The only way we can do that is to increase trust and confidence in people coming forward to record such incidents. And that's partly why I'm here tonight, and that's partly why I do attend other events like this, to try and raise that awareness and increase that trust and confidence, because I think it's unacceptable. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, basically, the point I was making is that it's not counted under Islamophobic attack. Because it's difficult for you to differentiate
it can be challenging,
intention.
Yes, I get that.
So because the law says intention. Now, what I would ask the police force to do is document it as an Islamophobic attack, so that it can be recorded in a fair manner.
I think that's a fair point, and very often we struggle with accurately reflecting whether a crime is not only a hate crime, but whether it's religiously or racially motivated. We could do better at that. We worked to the legislation we're given, obviously, but I take your point. We could be better at that, and we should be better, and we should be more aware of what's happening. For me, within Devon, the only way I can do that is if I have a strong network of support that gives me the reality of the picture, as opposed to the recorded crimes, which are so small in number they can't be realistic. Coming back to yourself, sir, I think could you just repeat your question again? Sorry.
Well, I was thinking back. You know, this discussion here is about fundamentalism and human rights, and you know, various speakers have said fundamentalism is having a set like the United Nations Charter on Human Rights and so on, and saying that's what fundamentalism is. And you know, people who hold strong views, which may be quite close to that, looking back, where there's been a lack of human rights, like for example with in Northern Ireland, for instance, and also to do with risks from weapons, NATO weapons and so on like that. The state and the police have come down quite harshly on what proved to be innocent individuals. And I was just stating the fact that I was pleased that you were saying, you know, we're more accepting of difference.
Yeah.
So that was it. Right?
Yeah, and the point I was going to make, I think all too often in this country, maybe that's the fault of being a democracy, perhaps. All too often, I think the majority view far outweighs the broader consensus of society as a whole. So the recent debate and the ongoing debate around immigration is a good example, where frankly the majority view leads to, for me, almost a blurring of political parties in their approach to immigration moving forward. To the point where, you know, we are now debating whether we leave the EU or not. I'm going completely off script here, but do we leave the EU or not because of the open door policy across the EU in relation to immigration? You know, there's as that moves forward towards the general election, I think that the policies for each of the individual political parties will not differ much, frankly, because they all are acquiescing to the majority view. And that's my personal opinion. And I think all too often the majority view does outweigh and does therefore then cause the difficulties that your friend next to you alluded to earlier.
I think when you say majority view, I think it's not necessarily the majority of people, it's lowest common denominator.
Sure. And I'll take your point.
You explain how in the past, in Iraq and Spain, faiths have lived together in harmony, accepted each other, where Jews and Muslims and atheists and Christians live together, accepting each other's point of view. That to me is a secular state or secular society where the society protects the faith's interest, allows people to practice their faiths, and this is, would you agree that this is what we should be aiming for, a secular society in this country and throughout the world?
I suppose the historical caliphates, they weren't secular in definition, because in essence the pillar of the state, of a caliphate, was Sharia law, but a divinely revealed law, and Muslims had a religious obligation towards the state to uphold this. But it was just because Islam believes that people must come into Islam by voluntary choice and not coercion, that we couldn't, not only can we not force people to become Muslim, but we can't impose Sharia on them who they don't even believe in the basis of that law. It's not unfair to have it imposed on them in the first place. What we wanted was, under no coercion, with their communities, fully catered for and accepted, that they make the voluntary choice without compulsion, without need, without any desire for advantage to become Muslim. We wanted a true voluntary choice, uncompelled, and that was the basis for plurality. And we believe that God intended not the human race wouldn't be all one nation and one religion. As the Quran says that God intended this to be the case. So it was a religious basis for the tolerance and acceptance, not a secular basis where we say, well, we don't know what the real purpose of life is, no one knows what the real truth of the reality is, so let's just have a agnostic kind of system. But to Christians, different Christian communities had their own Christian law, which was again a theocratic law. Jews had their own law. I suppose atheists had maybe a mixture of whatever culture they came from, their particular laws or traditions and things like that. And that was pretty much how the society was organized. It was practical and trying to be fair. I don't think I don't know how well that would work in nation states concept, the nation state concept, or in democracy where the minority is at the will, in theory, of the majority at times. Or the one law for all, which they view as to be, that's fair, one law for everybody, isn't that fair? But who decides that law, and who's it based on? The problem is, one law for all sounds really great until you actually delve deeper, and it actually is enforced conformity to a particular law system that not everyone might necessarily agree with, and so on. So that was the kind of Islamic approach. But I wanted to pick up something that my colleague mentioned regarding the EDL, actually. The EDL, what Tommy Robinson, he's now former leader of the EDL, but what he said before, and what many EDL people said before, is that Muslims taking over this country, they're a threat to our way of life. They want to apply their Iraqi law or whatever idea, which and so on, which was that funny little YouTube clip. They want to apply their Sharia law on everybody, and so on and so forth. They're taking over. At one point, he mentioned on the BBC, no less, that if there's not a terrorist attack by a Muslim in this country, the Muslim community will feel the full force of the EDL. Under the religious incitement to religious hatred law, I think that classifies as threatening language and behaviour. Why hasn't he been arrested? Why hasn't they been prosecuted? If I was to replace the word Muslim from what they say and replace it with gay or Jew or Christian or whomever, or Sikh or whomever, I would be done immediately for inciting, hatred against people of different sexual preference or of race or so on, instantly, and rightly so. But the EDL have had free reign to incite hatred, saying Muslims are a threat to this country. That is not inciting hatred. All the things they've said about Muslims, is that not inciting hatred? Do not people get angry and hate and increase hate against Muslims by what they've said? And I want to make a distinction. There's a difference between saying, I disagree with Islam, I think Islam is wrong, I think Islam is illiberal. That's intellectual criticism. That's fine. But to say Muslims are a threat and they're taking over, we have to act, we have to do something, that is Islamophobia, and that is inciting hatred. There's a clear difference between the two, and I think that maybe, obviously, Tony Robinson and EDR are not majority based in Devon and Cornwall. They're not based in Devon and Cornwall, so nothing about your police force. But why hasn't the police in their respective areas dealt with what is an obvious breach of the law? And that's a question that we should raise, and I think it needs to be raised very, very clearly.
And I think there should be a consistency in our approach across all police forces. So I wouldn't disagree with you on that. I think very often you've got to look at the specifics of a case, of an incident, and make a judgment call on the legislation that's available to us. But the consistency should be there. I agree.
But surely the basis of the law is what is the consent of people. If you don't have the consent of people, you can't police. If you haven't got the confidence and belief from the majority of the people in this country, you couldn't police it. And the people who make the decisions as to what that is are the politicians. And if you look, the one person you haven't got here that you should have here really is a lawyer who, an intellectual and theoretical lawyer, who will claim the way in which society works. And without the consent of people, it won't happen. And you have to have a system which somehow synthesises the views of everybody, you, me, the policeman, everybody else. It all has to be synthesised and to come to something which we all find within tolerable limits. And provided you've got that, you've got a reasonably civilised, reasonably good country. And I'd much rather be living in this country than anywhere else in the world, I have to tell you, because it's a wonderful place to be, and we have a good system of law, we have quite a good system of politics, and everybody tries, I think, to do the best. There are two things that haven't been mentioned. One is the fact that with duties, with rights, come duties. You can't have one without the other. If you've got rights, you've got to have duties. And it's that balance that is so difficult to achieve. And this country, I think, has done rather well. But when we start to become pompous and overconfident and think we've got it right, to look back 10, 15, 20 years and see what happened in Northern Ireland, because that's part of our country. And that we have managed somehow, that has somehow been accommodated is absolutely amazing. And I have a reasonable confidence that I'll be able to walk from here to where I live tonight without being attacked by some ghastly person. I might be, there is a chance, but it's a very, very small chance. It's a far lesser chance than would be in most other parts of the world. So I'm also glad for all that you've said, and I've been delighted with how accommodating and how reasonable you all are. And let's keep it that way. That's what this country's about, being accommodating everybody and trying somehow to find a way that we can all live together, which is what we want to do, isn't it? Mums go home to tea.
Thank you.
If I can just, sorry.
Yeah, do you want to take a point? And how would it define this?
The last one, too, then.
Okay.
I suppose there were just two comments I was going to make. One was, I think the headlines like the Daily Mail, one sees occasionally, are very close to inciting hatred. I mean, I'm really shocked sometimes how they get away with it. I mean, clearly they take legal. And the other thing is that this gentleman said about walking home safely. Too many times I've walked down Queen Street and seen young girls having their headscarves pulled off their head. So I do know that in the Muslim community, people's children, there's a lack of imagination if children of other races were being attacked because of the way they were dressed. There'd be an outrage, and yet I see young Muslim women having their headscarves, and of course they might not be reported as an attack, but it's an attack and it's bullying. And that was one of the things that really got me involved in interfaith in the city, because I thought, actually, the citizens of this city need to be more aware to try and work together and have a little bit more empathy and understanding of how they'd feel if it was happening to them.
I know we've got to go, but can I just ask one last question, and that is to ask you what you think about British values.
What are British values? You know, that's an interesting question, because obviously David Cameron likes to wax lyrical about it. But if people say British values are, let's say, honesty, decency, and fair play, I say, okay, but is that only for Britain? I mean, does no one else believe in decency, fair play, and honesty? It's something very nationalistic, something very parochial about the idea of British values. I would say that just values, really. I mean, human values, decent values. I don't think you'll find a country say, oh, no, we don't believe in decency and fair play. No, that's not our national values. So I think they're very vague. I think it's problematic when you have politicians dictating to us values that we have to abide by. It's almost pontificating as to what values we have to abide by diktat. And then you'll go down a very dark road, which I think European history should be full of lessons about when politicians dictate to us what particular values. There's only one key value that the state, I would say, should only be concerned about, and that is that the human beings that live in this land, on this part of the earth's crust, that is Britain, are abiding by the reasonable laws which, generally, I don't think we disagree with. Obviously we don't disagree that murder should be prohibited. We don't disagree that rape should be prohibited. We don't disagree about all these things that we actually agree on. But to say, well, there are some people who are slipping this net, we have to make a law that criminalizes certain opinions. Obviously, that's a bridge too far. I think that's what we have to be worried about when they say there's British values you must subscribe to, otherwise, in order for you to be here, otherwise you don't belong here if you don't subscribe to British values. So David Cameron said it's not a choice as well, which is ironic considering Scotland had a choice about British values. But I think it should be a choice as long as subscribing to the laws which we commonly agree with. Obviously, no one say that should be a choice, but values, the government shouldn't be telling us what our values should be, and I think that's very worrying. If someone wants to be an antisocial, selfish individual, then he has to be, should be allowed to be an antisocial. That's his personal values. Let them be a personal values. But if they want to be a very neighbourly and sociable person, let them have those values. But the government shouldn't be telling us what values flies, what values doesn't fly. I think that's that's my concern.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Center for Human Rights, Social Equality, and the brothers from the mosque, and the chair of the trustees, Sheikh Hassan, is here. The first time ever we did in partnership with the mosque to come out and holding this fantastic conference in celebration of International Human Rights Day, universally, and we booked really more discussion, and we haven't finished yet because this is the beginning of a series of conferences we're going to conduct, because the public asking us what is the mosque doing, why they are not out. We are, our doors are open and we are out and we have platforms, and I would like to thank you everyone, and maybe wrapping up in the summary to say what is the way forward to take out from here and what we want to do in the future. And after 3 months, maybe March or February, soon, after 2 months, we're going to have another conference related to faith and again aspects of human rights and values, and we're going to invite an expert in human rights, representative UK in the United Nations, Professor Malcolm Evans from Bristol University, this is the plan for ourselves, and again maybe our brothers will join us, and Devon Faith and Belief Forum as well. And this is where we need to drive Exeter toward more intellectual debates publicly in the community. This is the way, instead to be just locked up at the University of Exeter, or in schools, we want to come out to the communities and open the door for this friendly debate. And would like to thank you again, and please, each of you, if you say a few words to wrap up and say what is the way forward. Thank you.
It will be a few words. I opened up with a bit of a policing perspective. I would do. I'm a police officer. I'm the commander for Devon. I want to provide the best possible policing service that I can and we can for the communities and the citizens of Devon. I cannot do that if there's intolerance, if there's hatred, if there's an unacceptance of difference. And I can't do that if people don't have the trust and confidence in us to provide that level of policing. And that's where links with the mosque, links with other minority groups across the county is very important to me. And I would like to continue building on the relationships that we already have in place. So thank you. It's been really interesting for the last hour or so. Thanks very much.
From my perspective, I would actually echo this thing about people do need to report. I remember we had a forum with the students a while ago at the police, and all sorts of things were coming out, and I did sort of say, well, why aren't you reporting that? And part of it was a reluctance on a number of students' parts to, because in certain cases there were international students and they came from certain states where you don't really want to deal with the police because that means it's bad, right? And so the very idea that the police should actually be involved in the community and responsive was a concept they just weren't familiar with. So there's an element of that which I think had to be bridged as well. I would emphasize what I said before. I do think the principle of no harm is quite a significant liberal principle which should be defended. And coming back to, is there such a thing as a British value? I don't know. It's probably not, but the one value which I think is certainly from my own education quite significant, and that's the value to uphold and have the right to dissent and to basically call those in power to account, and that's absolutely essential.
This forum has been amazing. Thank you everyone for attending, and I just want to just touch on a couple of things that was discussed. As from the perspective of Muslims, it seems that Muslims in general are open game in terms of from after studying the media, and also from the point of view of the law. And we've discussed that anyway. And this narrative that the EDL were putting out, and just generally you hear certain people talk about in terms of the Muslims that they're here to change your lifestyle. I mean, this phrase that Muslims are here to change your lifestyle or change your values or what, is exactly the same phrase that Pharaoh used for when Moses came to save the children of Israel, and so I mean it's a very fear-mongering phrase, and it occurs again and again. And what I would recommend everyone is to continue discussing, learning, reading. Reading is very important. And in terms of having a community, I mean the model community that that the Prophet Muhammad tried to establish when he migrated from peace be upon him, when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, he was one of the first people to establish a constitution. When in Medina there were Jews, there were Muslims, and there were people from different communities, and he established a constitution so much so that everyone agreed that if one person is attacked, then everyone will come and defend that person, doesn't matter what background he's from. And if we are defending ourselves, everyone together will come and defend each other, doesn't matter what background you're from. That was the first constitution in Islam, and it was carried forward all the way, and it, I would argue, influenced the Renaissance, because it's not a coincidence that it was after 1453, the opening of Constantinople, that the Renaissance happened. In 1453, Constantinople opened, and the Muslims gave or spread the knowledge that they had studied in Baghdad and all these different parts of the world. And so, I would just say that, let's just open our minds and open our hearts. And again, thank you very much for the invitation, and also you guys coming, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I'll keep it brief. I know I've been nattering on today quite a lot, a bit too much. But what I'll say is, nothing new under the sun goes the expression. And I think a lot of what we see today with us, the Muslim community, has been repeated throughout history in the UK and in other countries. Catholics, Irish, Jews, we've seen the same cycle. Gypsies, we've seen the same cycle of intolerance towards minorities. And I think what was the point of going through all those problems if we didn't learn those lessons about how not to treat minorities? And it's exact same arguments. It's strangely the exact same arguments about taking over, about imposing a new culture or a new way of life, or birth rate is gonna make the indigenous population a minority. All this is the same arguments from 100 years ago. It's like they all have the same songbook or something. So we have to be careful about this, and we have to deal with this kind of hysteria, this hatred. We also have to deal with our politicians who their answer to everything is just to legislate, as opposed to better in implementation of existing laws. And I think that this is probably a common theme that even the police say, is that we need to legislate just better enforcement of the laws that are designed to capture the violent people, they're designed to capture those who incite hatred, incite people to treat each other in a nasty way. That these laws are there, they work fine. Why, the need to more legislation? So we have to be careful about this. But I think I'll end by saying this. A lot of what we think about other people in the world is generally untrue. Most people would never accept the kind of caricatures or stereotypes media would portray of these different ideologies, different ideas. Most human beings are very similar, actually, in how they actually like to live and so on. They wouldn't live under really nasty regimes or nasty things without the same issues and concerns that we all face. And we shouldn't demonize people and misrepresent them. But what I will say is this. I would also actually say that the media have a lot to answer for when they take a very selected few individuals which are crazy, nutty, very have views which do not represent the mainstream, and then say this is a dichotomy between this group, and if we don't implement these laws against extremism, these are the kind of people who are spreading, even though amongst, let's say, the Muslim community, certain individuals, I will not name, are fringe, extreme fringe. Any Muslim here can have a wedding celebration with more people invited than they have members in their group. Yet the BBC and the Sun, they love these people. They get so many invitations. You think they're caliph of the world, the amount of invitations that they get, but it's not the case. So I suppose what I really am saying is, the only real way we can break through all these problems is to have better communication between us. And I don't mean internet forum commenting, because that also causes more problems sometimes. But actually to meet people, to see what they say, to see the kind of ideas that they portray. As I said, and I've been plugging my organisation, but my organisation was MDI was just an attempt to say, look, you can have debate and you can strongly disagree with each other, but you can still be friends afterwards. You don't have to agree with everything to say, if I just got to disagree with it, doesn't mean I have to hate you or have to treat you differently. And I think that's something that we have to engage in. More communication, better understanding, and hopefully we can avoid repetition of the past. Thanks.